Okay, so fossils are our main source of evidence to suggest that organisms have changed gradually over a period of time, but there are other pieces of evidence to support the fossil evidence that scientists have found. And those pieces of evidence are comparative embryology and comparative anatomy. Now, sometimes you may hear those both just come under comparative anatomy. I tend to separate them, but you may hear them come underneath that same banner. Comparative anatomy, sometimes you will actually hear them talk about that also in terms of homologous structures, so meaning similar structures within those organisms. And some teachers may even talk about the pentadactyl limb as being a form of evidence, and that's fine, but they can all come under the banner of homologous structures. I separate them then into embryology and anatomy. But there's also biogeography and there's also comparative DNA sequencing. Both the biogeography and DNA sequencing are not ones that we assess at St Paul's, but they are pieces of evidence that are certainly there, and you may also hear other teachers and other students mention them before, and that's not to say that they're incorrect, because they're not. It's just not what we're forming as part of our assessment. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So comparative anatomy, that's when we're going to be looking at similarities and differences of body parts. Our embryology, again, similarities and differences at the embryonic stage. And then there's the chemical differences such as our DNA. So I'll just move me again. Let's look at the first one, which is comparative embryology. So as the name suggests, we're looking at the embryonic stage of an animal's development. So scientists have, over a period of time, looked at anatomical and also developmental, how they develop through their embryonic stage, and those similarities and differences between different organisms there as evidence for evolution. So comparisons of all our vertebrate embryos show that there are similarities during those earlier stages of development, and this is indicating that perhaps once we have had a common ancestor, and from that common ancestor brings about those similarities, but then the branching changes as we progress in that developmental stage, again indicating those branches of development separating similar to those other organisms that we've had. So what might explain that? Now, I must do a disclaimer. This picture on the right hand side we often use in class as a little bit of an indication of how things might be similar, but these are only drawings. They are not what the organisms look like, and it's a good teaching tool, but it's not an exact representation there. So our embryology is the studies of how an embryo develops up to the stages of being born. Now, the reason they provide some evidence for evolution is because they are looking very similar in the beginning, but some of those traits don't persist as they develop further on. Some of those traits disappear as they develop. So, for example, humans and fish have gill slits in the very earlier stages. Now, in fish, they develop into gills, but obviously we don't have gills, so they disappear before birth. So unless we had a common ancestor that we developed those gill slits from, there's no real point of us having them. As we don't have gills now, we use lungs to breathe. So there had to have been some common ancestor somewhere that brought the two of those organisms together. Otherwise, there was no real point with having those. Here are some of the others that you may also see in class. Gills are no longer needed, so in our chicken and our human they disappeared, whereas they stayed in the fish and axolotl, which are amphibians and so forth. So another type of evidence for evolution is comparative anatomy, so looking at similar anatomy structures or anatomical structures. So now we're looking at structural features of the organisms, and that's called our homologous structures. So organisms that have similar structures often have close evolutionary links and therefore similar relations in the past as well. Now, one of those is the pentadactyl limb. So if I go to the next slide here, you'll see the structures, which is the pentadactyl limb, across a variety of different organisms here. So you can see the human, second from the right, and we have got that one upper bone, which in us is our humerus. Then we've got our ulnar radius, and then we've got our carpals, metacarpals, our phalanges, and so forth. But if you look at the bird, they've got some similar structures there. So too does the lion, with the upper bone, the humerus, dividing into the two, and then they've got the tarsals and metatarsals. Same with the horse, frog, and whale. Now, why would we all have similar structures there when we all use those parts of the body for a very different purpose? Now, this diagram here is a really good diagram to show those similar features and structures in each of the different organisms here. So we can see here the humerus in the human is shaded purple, and you can see that both the bat, the horse, and the dolphin all have that same structure. And again, the same for the orange and green structure, which is ulnar and radius in the human. You can too see that the horse and the dolphin and the bat all have those structures. So even though they have different functions for them, the fact that anatomically we are so similar and have those same structures, they provide evidence that we once shared a common ancestor. So homologous structures are features that are similar across different species. And again, we want to keep driving home, I suppose, that these pieces of evidence suggest that we once had a common ancestor that was similar to all of these organisms, again indicating that evolution once occurred. Some other structures that are of interest again here is that the heart of a fish has one chamber, amphibian 3, reptile 4, humans 4, that you can see again that move from simple to complex. So we are evolving over time and becoming more and more complex. So looking now at our next form is another type of evidence to suggest that we all evolved from a common ancestor, and this one is not accessible. However, looking here is comparative DNA sequencing. So now with newer and newer technologies, more and more evidence is coming to hand. And now we are able to look at the DNA sequences of different organisms and actually see which organisms are actually closer. And that indicates, again, that closer relationship in that evolutionary tree. So we would expect that sisters from the same parent would have closer relationships with their DNA. Cousins, okay, a little bit different again, but then pluck out somebody from a totally different family. There may be some similarities, but some differences. If you imagine that as an analogy, the closer they are related, the more similar DNA that they're going to share. And here is one example here where we have the elephant, the whale, and the hippo. And two of these are more closely related, and they're not the ones you think. So look up and see which ones you think might be more closely related there. So our DNA is our genetic coding. Again, if this is something that you really have an interest in, then biology is a subject that you are going to find interesting, and there are a couple of DNA subjects in our U12 course. So the DNA sequencing does differ between species, but some have a greater similarity than others, and the closer they are, or the more similarities they have, the closer they are actually related. Organisms like our monkeys or our chimpanzees that people always say that we evolved from, which we know is not to be true. We didn't evolve from the apes, we just share a common ancestor. Interestingly, 99% of the DNA is shared, that we actually have a lot of similar DNA to those chimps, and that again is due to how close we are linked evolutionary. So having a look, and just as a summary, these are our closest relative. So they are where we branched off from closest. Okay, so gorillas, even though they're closer, not as close as the chimpanzees, which means they branched off that chain a little bit earlier if you imagine a pedigree, if you were doing your family tree. So you can see here in this diagram down here, it's a really basic evolutionary tree of life, and you can see that there's different branches as we go. So we can see our earliest life forms down here, then this tree is branching off and so forth. So if we come down to this evolutionary tree down this way, this is where we're coming with a lot of our mammals, and we come down this way, and then the further we branch off from that tree, the further we are from those original bodies. But humans and our apes will have gone off on one path, whereas some of these other animals will have branched off at a different time. Now, one of our other pieces of evidence that we can use to support the theory of evolution and that we all evolved from a common ancestor is biogeographical distribution. Now, in Year 9, you would have looked at plate tectonics and how the continents have drifted since Earth has formed and the plates are moving further and further away. Some of the patterns that we've had in evolution can actually be attributed to this movement where some organisms once lived on one plate and now look different to their ancestors that are, or their relations that might be found on another plate. For example, marsupial possums live only in Australia and South America and nowhere else in the world. Now, thinking of plate tectonics and where those two countries are, why might that be? And if you're interested, you can go and watch the YouTube clip that we have just there. So the distribution of closely related species on continents that were once joined is showing that new species can actually evolve and change if they're exposed to different environments. So one of those ones is Darwin's finches, where he noticed that some finches actually looked different on different continents where they may have, or in different countries where they may have been separated either by an ocean or by mountain ranges or so forth. And what's actually happening is, depending on the climate that's there, the food that's available and so forth, they have changed so that they don't actually resemble that much the ancestor that they originally evolved from. Add to that then, we can have those changes. They haven't got that interbreeding with the original population. It's only now that new population, and that can give rise to a new species. So biogeography is the study of variation in living things in relation to their geographical regions. And as I said before, Darwin and Wallace noticed in their travels that we had finches in some areas that were more similar than others in areas that may have been closer, and some might have been more similar when they were quite a long way away. And as we said on an earlier slide, that sometimes those features such as oceans, mountain ranges may have marked that boundary where that interbreeding couldn't happen because they were too far away. So those that were on one side bred within themselves and created a new species. That's it for today, looking at the different types of evidence to support evolution. We will then go on and have a look at theories of evolution in our next video. See you then.